Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the next episode in the Mondays in MMORPGs series, where we sit down and talk about all the different fun things we love about MMORPGs, pros and cons of MMORPGs, good things, bad things in the industry, so on and so forth. I'm Tim Anderson, aka Renfell, and I am joined by these two bearded beauties.
Hello, I'm Jesse, aka Scribbles. Work on Defend the Night with Leksur here. Just here to talk about our love for MMORPGs.
And as said, I'm Leksur. I'm the lead designer of Defend the Night. And if by the time this actually goes live, I am the buzz guy. Just say.
All right, today's episode is going to be all about remote teams. Pros and cons of working remote versus working in a physical space, and whether or not, for example, has COVID affected small indie teams versus how it's affected AAA teams, so on and so forth. I think there is a lot of interesting things to look at from this perspective because the three of us have all been involved in remote teams um, for the for the past several years. I have, on a personal level, I have been remote since 2000. January of 2008 was when I went remote because that was the year that I moved abroad, was living in Bulgaria, and started my writing career. And I went from doing a physical job where I was working in construction for years and needing to have, a brick and mortar space and a vehicle and needing to drive places and show up at locations to do jobs to then transition over to this job that I could do from home. And then for a very long time, it's not really our main gig anymore, but for a very long time, Chris and I had our travel blog, and so it was all about traveling to different places, going to different countries, working on projects that are on location for maybe a month to 3 months, but then you're coming home and you're spending 8 months, 12 months, 15 months completing the contract completely remote from that environment. And then having worked now as a freelance writer since 2008, I would bet it's been over 1,000 contracts now that are completely remote. The only times I've done any physical work in the past decade have been when I need to go on location for a project, and we're only on location for a month to 3 months. Everything else has been remote. So I've been preaching remote at conferences for many, many years. That was a big part of our presentation when we were going and doing presentations for the travel brand was the benefits of doing the travel blogging gig and working remotely. Maybe having a home office in Barcelona or Rome or London or wherever you want to be for the next 6 months. But working remotely is something I've been a big fan of for a very long time, and I want to say my opinions have been justified during this pandemic of watching all of these companies switch to remote and then having some of these companies come out and publicly say it worked so well, we saved so much money, we're going to keep doing it because
The overhead's just crazy,
oh
man.
yeah, and
For us,
your people are happier for the most part. There are
Mhm.
some people who crave and need that social interaction, but then there's people like me who I can turn that introvert extrovert switch on and off as needed. So I have
Mhm.
no problems working from home for long stretches of time, and then I'm just as comfortable going in, co-working with people for a few weeks on location somewhere. But yeah, remote. I'm a big
starting
fan of remote.
starting up a company and standing up a company is almost a must-have for someone in this genre. Like indie games. It's almost you almost need to have that remote element to it, just because the costs are so much lower. You don't have that brick and mortar rent every day. But yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about going to the job away from family, um, and having your own space to work in. But a lot of people are getting that space at home, so I don't know, man. I think it's a win-win. I think the pandemic has really opened everyone's eyes to how effective it is. You're not commuting an hour to the job site. You can pretty much live anywhere as long as you have an internet connection, and that's really attractive to a lot of people. Not having to live in San Diego or some Los
Place
Angeles.
where the cost of living is just insane.
Cost of living is just terribly high, and I think a lot of the game companies have folded because of their rent in those areas.
I know of
They're
one
just
studio in particular, which I'll get into later, that happened to for sure.
right.
Yeah.
It's just
Do
Um,
you have kids, Jesse? Do you have kids, Lexer?
no,
You work from home full time, right? Lecture.
Yes, I
Jesse, you
have for the
still
last
have.
12 years.
Okay, so you're in the same boat as I am. We've both worked from home for like 12 years now. Jesse, you still have a day job. Your day job, do you have to commute or do you work from home?
Since the pandemic, we've been working strictly from home. So, but yeah, I mean, it's so much more beneficial for me to do that.
I do have a
Just do
question because you have kids, and I see that you have an office space that you have a door
it.
to, and it's locked
Mhm.
off. So one of the quick questions I have for you, because I know this is something that's come up a lot in our presentations, is was there a transition period for your kids and your wife when you went from working out of the house to working at home and being like, hey, look, I know I'm here, but I'm not really here. Like, if the door's closed, don't come a knocking. I mean, did you ever
Well,
have that?
when we had the start of the pandemic, they weren't allowing daycares to operate here in Pennsylvania, where I'm at. So we were having a really big growing pain, large growing pain to figure that out. But since they've opened the daycares back, so I can actually, you know, between the operating hours, whichever you deem it necessary, I can take my kids to daycare. And I have an older child that's in school right now,
Okay.
so it's good to to have them do their own thing away from dad and knock on the door. But sometimes you can't always do that.
It's a tricky thing. I don't have kids is the reason I asked because
Mm,
I know I have friends who have children and
mm,
there's always been a transition period where it's hard for children, not necessarily for the spouse or significant other, because adults can generally adapt to it pretty quickly. I know from a kid's perspective, it's like, mommy or daddy's home, and they can't quite. I guess it depends on the age level of the child as well, but it's harder for children to figure out. Yeah, mommy and daddy's home, but
not really.
and
Yeah.
I'm not really like, and that's where in having an office space where you can close the door can be beneficial because it's like you can just have that. You can still have that barrier of going. You know, it's something
Yeah.
that's teachable and trainable, I guess.
At a certain age, it's okay. But my youngest one, he's below the age of 4, so
Oh, that's you
for
don't
him
have to
it
worry.
was
No,
yeah, it doesn't work. You
no,
got to take him to daycare for that because he doesn't understand that kind of
yeah.
thing. So yeah, for the older child, he's 7, so it works out fine for him. Hmm.
So since the three of us have all been involved in independent game studios, I think we can speak with authority on the pros to working remotely and how COVID didn't really affect the development on any of the games that we were working on because everybody was already remote anyway. Um, but
The only thing it really affected is at the start of the pandemic, everything was closed down. So there was a month there that no one was doing anything because they were trying to figure out their situation.
gotcha.
Kids were at home.
But it was
Yeah,
minimal enough that it was, a
yeah,
blip on the radar.
yeah.
Because I know the big thing that a lot of major studios have talked about is working remotely has now like cut our productivity in half, or it has cut our productivity by 30% or something. And I mean, I could say you could look at any AAA company. I'd say that's probably the same for every company. They've all done press releases, whether it's, Cyberpunk got pushed back. There's multiple games that have been pushed back because of that. I believe like the Hogwarts open world Harry Potter RPG got pushed back because of the pandemic. But for small indie studios who were already working remotely, there wasn't that big of an impact. Um, Chris and I have, my wife, she and I have talked a lot about this because we are not party people. We don't go out to get our social interaction. Like we might have, we do like to go out to like if there's an event at the park, if there's like a food festival going on, we're big on like food festivals. Like you go out and you hang out with people and get some good food, go, beer festival, things of that nature. But we're also not the type of people who have social gatherings and we don't attend like social gatherings with friends. Like we don't go over to somebody's house and have like a Thursday night game night. Um, because I play video games and she can't be bothered. She doesn't really care about parties and stuff. So when the pandemic started, for us, it was like nothing really changed for us other than we stopped going to like the park for the events because there were no more events taking place. Um, but other than that, our normal routine has always been wake up, work. We both work from home. She's worked from home now for full time. Chris, how long have you worked full time from home? Like 3 years? She's nodding her head. So yeah, 3 years ish. She's worked full time from home. And before that, she had periods where she would work from home. Like for 3 years, we managed an Airbnb, or she managed, I should say, she managed our Airbnb in Cancun for like 3 years. And so she worked on that full time, and it was at our home. So we just had a couple spare bedrooms there. So she did that full time. So she's done like full time at home and then gone and worked part time out at places over the last like 8 years. But the pandemic hasn't affected our lives at all, for the most part, because it's pretty much always just been, work from home, go to the grocery store when we need groceries, and then go out for a run 2 or 3 times a week at the park. So that hasn't really changed. Um, so yeah, and we don't have kids, so I didn't have to deal with any sort of transition period. And it sounds like you guys only had about a month of slight
Yeah.
downtime.
Well, we had, at the start of the pandemic, and then we had individuals get sick, come down with COVID. So, and you had that. But yeah, we really didn't have a whole lot of downtime. If anything, it sped up a little bit. So,
People having more time to work from
mhm,
home.
right.
Well, that's one aspect of it. I do think there's something to be said on one of the cons to remote working. Um, and I'll let you guys speak to it from your perspective as well. But I know one of the things that from my perspective, spending 6.5 years, on Saga was one of the downsides to working remote. As much as there can be said for the positives of people being home and having your own flexibility to work on things, one of the downsides is there is something to be said for, and technology is making this easier and easier, by the way, because when we started,
Hands-on training.
yeah, 2014, when I first started doing game development, it was a lot more difficult than it is today in terms of having everyone have access to the files, at the same time being able to co-work in an online environment. So in the earlier days, it was a little trickier than it is today to have that, to replicate the office space environment where I can walk over to somebody's desk and ask a question and get it answered immediately. That's tricky, even in a remote environment, because you often have people that are either in different time zones, could even be across the world, especially if you're doing like concept artists who you're contracting from. I worked with Mikhail, who he lives in Bulgaria. That could be tricky to get him on at a meeting with 6 or 8 other people because he's 8 hours ahead of everybody else. So that part of it can be a little tricky and can be a potential downside to people. And then some people have said, I didn't experience this personally, but some people have commented on the negativity of not being able to brainstorm efficiently when you're all in the same space. But I never found that to be a problem because if you're all on video chat, what's the difference of being in a physical space versus being on video chat? Because you can still see each other, body language is still there, tone of voice is still there. I don't know what
Right.
you guys' opinions on that are.
Yeah, I don't see any issues with that so far with like our team meetings or anything like that. But I could probably say that um, if you have a mocap studio
Okay,
and you're doing a lot of acting and that sort of thing, you could really be hampered or hindered by not having that working space.
that's a good
Um,
point. And that might be where a lot of the delays for these AAA games come from because they all do motion capture.
yeah, so but it's getting better. So it's getting so good now that a lot of people are going back to old movies and doing mocap from old movies. It's really getting peculiar. So
Technology is fun.
mhm,
Well, there's a website out there that will actually take video and attempt to rig a character with animations based on the movement in that video.
mhm.
Well, that's
I can't
interesting.
remember the name of the site, but I played with it a little bit, and I mean it was very impressive, even though it was a very early stage.
So you're
So
saying they
with
could
tools
take
like
any
that,
movie?
yeah, obviously the better quality, the better.
Sure.
Like if you had a green screen, that would obviously be easier for the AI to work with. But yeah, you could take anything. I mean, I took one of me doing jumping jacks. I know that sounds far fetched, but yeah, me doing a jumping jack, plugged it in, and the character was doing a jumping jack. I mean,
The problem is the scene has to have all points visible. So if you have
yeah,
like half the points, like here, if I'm sitting on a chair,
Mm.
you don't know where my feet are at. So your feet could be up here in the mocap. So there's issues with that. It has to have all points. That's what I'm saying. But yeah, the technology is great.
I think, as I'm looking at it now, I think it's Radical,
Well,
which
yeah,
is
Radical has
getrad.co.
I'm gonna have to look
right.
into that now, just for shits and giggles, and see what y'all are talking about.
It's very impressive. I mean, I don't know where it is in stage of usability right now, but it's because of tools like this that you no longer need to have this multi-million-dollar mocap studio. You don't need specialized equipment anymore. It's just, honestly, it's amazing.
It's been pretty interesting. I've watched a bunch of the behind the scenes content for Red Dead Redemption 2, and they've talked a lot and they've shown a little bit, but the actors have talked a lot about the the way that they do motion capture for Red Dead, the way that they did it for Red Dead 2 was a lot different than a lot of other companies do motion capture, and it sounded pretty amazing. In terms of, it's like you're being on a stage and you're actually acting. And I know that they did that, I think, for God of War, even the most recently God of War. You're on a set. It's a green screen set, but you're on a set and you're actually acting and interacting with things, as opposed to the mocap of say 10 years ago, where it was mostly, you've got a different actor doing the mocap, and then a voice actor comes in and gets stuck in a booth and just does voice acting on top of the motion capture. Now it's the technology has advanced so much that they're able to do it all. Like the actors are coming in, they're actually doing the mocap and voice perform, and they're very specific about that. It's not voice acting. It's voice performance. It's not. I'm not a voice actor. I'm doing a performance. I'm on stage. It's me. I'm the person and I'm the voice. So it's capturing my facial expressions. So I'm a performer. I'm not just the voice actor. So I thought that's a fun distinction, and I think it's cool to see where that technology is going to go, especially if we see more companies transitioning to the remote environment, because nobody knows what's going to happen. We're still in early, I should say, we're in early 2021. We're still getting vaccines rolled out. Companies are still going to continue to evolve over the rest of this year with the working environment. So it'll be interesting to see what that turns into. Um, I do know one of the things we wanted to talk about in this episode was the cost benefit of being a remote team versus having a brick and mortar space and needing to have people come in and clock in and everything else, because it goes so much more beyond just rent on the office
You could
space
pay,
or the lease. That's a big component of it. But then you also have, you think about this from the employee perspective. You have drive time, you have gas, you have for your vehicle, you have insurance for your vehicle. Maybe you're commuting on a train. There's the cost of all that public transportation, but also the time that is spent by that person. If you've got a 2-hour commute every day, 1 hour there, 1 hour back, that's 2 hours of your day that is, and I'm going to use air quotes here, wasted by needing to go to a physical location. There is a cost analysis benefit that you can do on those 2 hours, because if that person is working from home and they're able to not have to deal with that 2-hour commute, and they're more rested and they're happier as a result of not having to deal with that commute every day, that they're going to do better work and they're going to be more energized when they work. So there's a lot of different cost analysis benefits that we can look at, not just from a rent perspective, but I do want to start with the rent because that's a big thing.
yeah.
Rent,
So
go ahead.
rent rent's gonna give you an extra employee
Yes,
pretty
at the
much
minimum.
right off the bat.
I was gonna say it depends on where you're renting and how much per square foot it costs.
So you,
I
you
mean,
just you just
I
up
mean,
your productivity, that much just by not having a brick and mortar store or
You,
yeah,
place to go.
I know that you live in Pennsylvania. I don't know where you live, Lexer.
I'm next door. I'm in Ohio.
So what are the costs of commercial? I mean, do you guys know like commercial space in your areas? Do you know what it costs to rent something, say, for 15, 20 people?
The Well, the last building that I had ownership of wasn't in this particular area, but it was creeping up on $100 a square foot. The building I had. Now it was in a very good location, so I mean, it's one of those things where location counts for an awful lot. Um, but that's part of having a brick and mortar. You have to find what fits within your budget. But to be honest, what most companies are charging these days for leases is it's flat out ridiculous. Because I'll be honest with you, when I bought a building to lease, the only way that I would need to have my lease that high as some of the neighbors around was if I basically bought it and had a management company take care of it, like take care of everything, which a lot of them do. You know, that's what a lot of people do. They'll buy strip malls, they'll buy just standalone buildings, and then they'll just have a management company take care of everything else.
Mhm.
Business wise, very good decision. I tried it, but the thing is, like, I for a long time I would see these buildings sitting just vacant, you know, and I was sitting there go, how do you justify having a building that would be bringing in so much money? Like you see, like say, like an old Kmart, you know, you think maybe $80 a square foot, right? There's probably what 16,000 square feet, 25,000 square feet. That's a lot of money you could be bringing in. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, how do you justify that sitting vacant for 3, 4, 5 years? And the reasoning is that it doesn't cost that much.
Yeah. There's so many aspects of this because your talent base is so huge when you're doing a remote. You can gather people from all different places of the world, and
Yeah,
then
your recruitment area.
it's just there's no brainer to have. I mean, why would you limit yourself to just the people in this one local area, or then have them move halfway across the world to get to you? That's just a no brainer to me. Just to do the remote teams, there's so many benefits to it.
I've
Not
worked with artists out of Bulgaria and a lot of this because I lived in Bulgaria, so there's this thing in me. It's a weird, call it whatever you want, but I have this sense of loyalty because I lived there for so long and I was involved with a girl from there for many years. And I know that there's a huge talent base there, and these people do great work. They also cost a fraction
Mhm.
of what it would cost me to hire somebody in the United States. And this is where you get people who will argue that if you're an American company, you have to use American labor. It's like, well, if the laws would make it less restrictive and less expensive to have to use American labor, then that might be a valid point of view. But the reality is we live in a global era with global internet and global communication. There's no reason to be limited and trapped in this local mentality. And people are like, yeah,
Global
but
current,
by doing that,
global
you're running the mom and pops out of business. Well, one could say that if mom and pop businesses who vote for and want to thrive in a capitalist society really want to do it in a capitalist way, then the capitalist way says that I need to go
Be
where the
cutthroat.
cheapest. Yeah, you're cutthroat. That's what the capitalist environment is about. So it's you can't have your cake and eat it too, is what it comes down to with
Right.
that. So
I mean, to put this into perspective of how cutthroat it is, I had someone make multiple false reports on a building that I owned just so that the people that were currently leasing it would leave because I had to shut down things. I had to get people to go investigate things, and all to whatever your local regulations are. To the point where they left. I'm like, sure, I'm just gonna put the building up for sale, and he offered me like almost nothing for it. I was so tired of dealing with it. I accepted. Plus, the pandemic started and all this stuff, and then he comes in when he finally signs the deadline. He's like, yeah, so I was the one that did all that. I was like, what? So, and I thought me and him were not friends, but we were on good terms. And it's like, I was shocked. I was like, I could not believe that this guy would do that. And I mean, it was persistent for like a year. Like every few weeks, another big complaint.
people do crazy things for
Yeah.
money sometimes. But on the rental space thing, sidetracking from talent for the minute, I do want to talk about the cost of leasing and renting, because I know of, I guess I was thinking earlier, I was thinking of one, but there's two studios that we know of that have in the last couple of years, independent studios that have gone under, or maybe not completely gone under, but there's I'm gonna say the two examples here in a minute, so this will have better frame of reference. But they've definitely been impacted by the cost of rent, and that's been partially responsible for what happened to them as studios. So the one is not a failed game per se, but a lot of people look at it and say, oh, it went from having 40 people on the team to now only having 6 or 8 people on the team. That is a failed game. But then the other one is definitely, I think we could look at it as a failed game. So the one is Shrine of the Avatar, and the other one is Chronicles of Illyria. Both of those have been well known, the documented cases of the rental costs being partially responsible for things that happen because it just costs so much money to rent. And I don't know that Chronicles of Illyria addressed it per se, but the Shrine of the Avatar team absolutely addressed it when they decided to remove to remote. But the transition was very much did the Kickstarter, got private investment, got up to like around 40 people developing the game. When I went to the office, I believe there was 30, the first time I went to the office, there was 36 people there. And then a few months they launched, and then just very quickly after that, they went from 36 people and they fired half the staff. And then very shortly after that, they fired more staff, left the building, and moved everybody to working remote. And the press release they did on that was about all of the benefits of going remote and how that was going to save them all this money and everything else. And I looked at that and went, I could have told you that 10 years ago because I've been working remote for all these years. And this is not me being arrogant. That's just me saying that's why I didn't want to have a physical office space for Saga of Leucemia, because why? Why spend you said at the beginning of this, Jesse, like that's it's an employee minimum. Because when you're looking at an office space that's going to cost you, let's say conservatively, $6,000 a month, conservatively, you're 70 grand in at that point per year. That's an engineer, a good engineer for 70 grand a year. And then if you're talking about being able to work with really good, and let me rephrase that. Hold on, let me back up from that. 70 grand is an engineer in the United States, because I can find 3 engineers willing to work for that same amount in a place like Mexico, and they're good engineers. There might be a little bit of a language barrier. In my case, no, because I speak Spanish. But I'm saying, let's say you work with someone from Russia, and that can be a little challenging, so on and so forth. Pros and cons again, but looking at that 70,000 a year, that's on the low end of a commercial rental space for a team of 15 to 20 people. You start getting bigger, like talking about the 20,000 square foot space that, like an abandoned Kmart or something. You're talking, $15,000-$20,000 a month in rent.
That's not that's yeah. It's heat. You got heat and everything else to
You
ponder
also
into
have
it.
to have insurance and
Mhm.
bonding
Yeah.
There's
and
maintenance. And, I
upkeep.
mean, trust me, you don't understand how much it costs to keep a sliding door working until you have to do it.
Same thing
The
with
invoices made me want to cry.
the one thing here. The good example of that you just said. So before my wife and I started running the Airbnb in Cancun, like we had never contemplated. Chris had known it because she worked in hotels for many years, but we never, even though she worked in hotels, we didn't. It didn't translate until we started renting rooms out in the house. And the first time someone threw a tampon down the toilet was when I went, "Oh, there are stupid people in this world who are going to make my plumbing bill be a nightmare." And then stuff would get thrown in the toilet, and it's like, do you not have common sense? Like, but the reality is that became this bill. And didn't matter how many stickers we put on the wall and notes that we left above the toilet, don't throw stuff in the trash, people would still throw stuff in the trash. And it became this maintenance bill that we never thought that was going to be a part of the reality of having an
Mhm.
Airbnb property. There are things that you're not going to know about until you start renting the property. And then it's like, oh shit.
And all I will tell you is that those issues are exponentially larger when you have a space that has more people in it. Like I
Hmm.
say, um, it's not the same thing as, but like you take a game studio. Let's say you've got 200 people in there, and it's obviously a large studio. Well, I've had places that were like that I didn't own. I was kind of helping out, and some of the things that I have seen were ridiculous. Like, not to get too gross. I
Sure. I
mean,
mean,
you think
it's valid.
it's pretty easy to use a toilet, right? But when you've got a log sitting on the toilet seat, well, now, not
And
only is it the fact that you got to get someone to clean that up, but how many people walked in there, saw that, and now have made a complaint?
to HR, and now they're physically or mentally traumatized, and now you've got to pay for their
Emotional
emotional distress,
distress,
and
and
yeah.
oh, I mean, it's there's anyone out there that runs a business or is basically like a landlord or a leaser or whatever. You've got some stories out there, and everything ranging to incredibly funny to make your stomach churn and everything in between.
So it's not just the rent, ladies and gentlemen. It is
No.
all of the associated headaches and maintenance that go along with being involved with a space that has to house multiple people. Um,
Right. Yeah, even if you have a studio with 10 people, you still need AC, you still need heating,
internet, yeah,
you need your internet, and you need internet
parking.
that will be good for the tasks being performed by those 10 people.
Parking is another big one too. I
Yep.
remember interviewing. This has been years ago. I interviewed with a company. I can't remember where it was. It might have been in Austin, Texas. But in their job description, they actually one of the perks of the job was free downtown parking. And I laughed when I went into the interview because they were like, and we include free parking. And I was like, well, that doesn't affect me because if I do take the job, I'll be finding a place that's close enough that I can walk or bike to work. And I kind of laughed and I was like, how much is that worth anywhere? And they listed off this number and I was like, are you like that was a huge number. I mean, it was close to $1,000 a month. I think it was like 700 and it was like 800
Yeah.
ballpark as I recall for per month for parking. And I went, you've got to
Basically,
be kidding me.
an economy class gaming rig every month.
Yeah, it was like that. That's you're talking, that's a lot of money for parking. Um, so if you strip all that out of the equation, and again, there's the pros to being in the same office space. You get quick access to everybody. You don't have to worry about digital storage. You don't have to worry about cloud storage. You could, everybody's on a local network. You can have your storage drives. You can have a local server, all that good stuff. Some of that was a lot more complicated back in 2014. I feel like it's a lot less complicated now in 2021 in terms of the technology that's made it available for us to be able to work remotely. I don't see any reason from a personal standpoint to have a physical office unless you're doing something like a dentistry where you have to have people that are there physically because they're getting their teeth worked on. They have to show up, and so you have to have a physical space for them. But game studios, really? I mean, can any of you? I can't think of a single reason why you need a physical space.
Well, it's a digital product, so there's no reason you can't do it remotely. Now, my wife works at an office, and there's some things you can't do digital. She has to drive into the office, like even at the height of the pandemic, she still had to drive in to go pick up file or pick up checks or check the mail because contracts were coming in. It's just the fact of the matter. This wasn't all digital, so she couldn't work 100% from home. Whereas what I do, it's all paperless. It's all digital. So there's no reason why I would ever need an office. But that's also because we're in an era now where you no longer need to have a physical space to be legitimate. Because that used to be the thing. You could say you're running a business till the cows come home, but if you don't have an office, people wouldn't really believe you. You know, it's like business cards. People used to say, like, show me your business card. I don't use business cards.
The only
I'm just
time
like,
I
here's my
yeah,
email.
the only time I use them anymore is when I go to conferences and conventions. I usually have like 300 or 400 printed up just so I can hand out at the convention. But that's the only time I use them is conferences.
Right.
I was just thinking though because we say we don't need it, but I see games like Ashes of Creation, and I only know this because Simmerg had Steven, I don't know his last name, on the show on
Sharif.
Sunday. Yeah, and he also promoted that they were hiring, and so I happened to check out their page, and it's a California physically based location. And I'm like, why would you need, especially as a startup, like why would you need to have a physical space for development? It blows my mind. I understand it if you were a company that was started 20 years ago, and so you had a physical space back when you still needed it, and therefore you still have it.
Right.
But I don't
Well,
understand. I don't know the mentality for me. It's just I can't
I'll
wrap my
try
head
to
around
see.
it.
I'll try to see it from their point of view. I mean, we all know that Stephen Shreve had a large amount of capital that he put forward towards his product and his studio. So it probably isn't going to hurt that bad. I mean, for all we know, he might even own the building.
Possible.
Again, pure speculation. It's just a possibility, which
Well,
would obviously reduce the cost.
you also bring up a good point because I use this a lot, and I've talked about this in public in the past. I think I even talked about it in my Diary of an Indie Game Dev show. I've always looked at the brothers who started Science Studios. They did the Myst games back in the
Mhm.
90s. They were very smart early on, and they bought a commercial property that they then turned into their game studio. And then they developed games for like 15 years or so, and then they eventually got out of game development and spent like 20 years not developing games. But while they weren't developing games, that space was then converted into office space that they rented out. And so they were still able to generate a healthy amount of income on a property that they already owned. Then, about 5 years ago, when the Mist Resurgence came back and they developed those new two games on Kickstarter Foundation, and I forget what the other one's called. And then they did the redone Mist like Legendary Edition on Kickstarter. Like they've gotten back into game development now in the last 5 or 6 years, and they've moved back into that space which they've held on to all these years. There are still office, as far as I understand it, there are still offices that are there being rented out, leased out, but then they've converted a section of that back into a new game studio. And I looked at that and went, that was a very smart thing for them to do 40 years ago,
Right.
was to purchase a space that way that you get around the lease requirements. But that's A, not feasible for most startups because you're coming into it without any capital. I guess there's no A, there's no B to that. There's just A. It's not feasible for
Well,
startups.
well, it's also that if you can afford to have that kind of capital when you're starting up, it's also a case of making sure your assets are being used effectively.
Hmm.
Like if you have empty office space, you should rent it out or find some way for it to earn its value. But that's something that, like, say you're someone who wants to start a game studio, it's not something you would probably think of unless you already had prior business experience. Where, like, say me or you or even Scribbles, we would walk in and go, okay, if we're only going to use 400 square feet of this 800 square foot property, it's still costing us the same amount. So how do we have that for extra 400 earn its value? If we can't, then that might not be a good place to set up. We might try to find somewhere else. But like what the Mist guys did, that was very smart. They're not using this. They're not using a studio. Convert it to an office space. Now all of a sudden, it's still in use. It's earning you an income, and it's there if you ever need it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of I don't understand the rent and lease mentality um, when companies are 10 years in and they've got a successful product or products and they're still leasing and renting. But I feel like we're getting to the point now with the pandemic, as bad as it's been, we have seen a lot of companies, not necessarily just game studios, but a lot of companies, some of which are game studios, who have come out a year into the pandemic and said, we like remote so much, we're going to have our entire workforce choose whether or not they come back into the office once the pandemic quits or they keep working from home. And I think that's great that they're offering those types of options, um, because we might see as the technology gets better and better and better, less and less of a need to rely on physical spaces. One of the things, and Joey and I haven't used it yet, but one of the things we noticed when we started diving into Unreal is that Unreal actually has a built-in co-working component to it, where you can set up your projects so that all the team members can log in and work remotely on the same project without needing to have a third-party solution set up for all that kind of stuff. Whereas and I haven't touched Unity in a year
Yeah,
now.
Unity has a thing called collab. Yes. So yeah, it's called Unity Teams.
Okay.
Did,
So they have the same
do
thing.
they still have that? Or is that one of the things they were shutting down? I can't remember anymore.
We'll have it. Used it 2 days ago.
Oh, okay. I think there was. Oh wait, no, it was their augmented reality stuff. Never mind. Sorry, I got confused.
Well, those options, because Unity didn't have that when it first started, so that's something that has evolved over time with that product. And I can't speak to Unreal because we just started using Unreal earlier this year, so I don't know how long it's had that. But I remember very distinctly when we first started using Unity back in 2014, there was no easy way to collaborate on the project together. So we were relying on things like a mega server and
Yeah.
Google Drive and Dropbox and stuff to get files around to people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a challenge that is slowly getting taken care of with technology. Yeah, it's not even an issue anymore. So that's why I think looking at 2021, I've just not seen a lot of reasons why you would want to have an office space. I mean, it is a tax deduction, so I mean, there is that aspect to it as well. If you're someone who's going to be on top of your finances to the point where you're trying to just nickel and dime every last little thing and try to get the most out of your taxable income, then there is that to consider. If you can write off $100,000 a year, um, but at the same point, you have to be generating enough income at that point to be able to pay for the $100,000. It's almost like, is $100,000 really that big of a drop in your bucket? If that makes sense, because if you're already
Yeah.
making enough money to pay $100,000 a year for rent, do you really care about getting taxed on that $100,000? I don't know.
Right.
That's
I
just
don't
something
know.
that popped into my head about a potential pro to renting is the fact that it's a tax write-off.
Yes, I don't get it. See, you have to go to the places that have a good talent pool. So those places are high
Expensive.
cost of living, expensive places to live, and you're limiting yourself just from that because what you have to do now is you have to pay more the people that live there more money, and then your rent's higher. So you're just shooting yourself in the foot a couple
Well,
different times.
you also just said something else that I think is a third
Mm.
a third thing that shoots you in the foot is by forcing yourself into that talent pool bracket.
Mhm.
Why would someone want to work for you when they can work for Blizzard? So you have to
Mhm.
offer them something that's equally competitive in terms of pay. Oh, so not only need somebody brought this up to me a couple years ago, like not only do you have to pay them well, if they go to Blizzard, what else do they get? Oh, they get cafeteria and a gym and free health
You
insurance
basically
for
have
all their
to match
families.
incentives.
You have to match incentives, and an independent company is never going to be able to do that if you're a bootstrapped or independently funded project, because you're talking you need millions to be able to do that kind of stuff.
Some game companies offer insurance for your pets, up to 3 pets.
That I did
I
not
mean,
know.
like stuff
That's
like that. Stuff like that. I mean, I just was going through some game development jobs. I always look at it to see what they're offering people,
sure.
and that's one of the perks. I mean, this is all overhead. This is all what you're trying to pass on to the consumer. No wonder games don't get done sometimes.
And
You
also,
pay,
no wonder games cost, and they're now going up to $70 for AAA titles. It's like there's a lot that has to go into hiring a team to work on these.
Mhm.
If you're dealing with that local talent pool that costs
mm,
an arm and a leg to hire.
right.
Um, speaking because I live in Mexico, and I've been here for since 2010. I have no desire to leave. Um, the reasons for that are just the cost of living is just ridiculously cheap. When you live in the city like I do, I've got a 200 up, 200 down connection. That's all I need. It's great for me. It's not a gigabyte, but it's a great connection. Our rent is affordable. It's a fully furnished place. All these things. The biggest reason I lived in here though is the universal health care, which costs me next to nothing compared to the United States. And then when you look at the cost of workers down here, um, I said earlier you can hire 3 people for the cost of one engineer in the United States. That's true for just about any industry you can talk about, because the cost here, you can offer someone $20,000 a year in US dollars, and they're going to be making more than the national average for anybody in their field. This is because the wages are just so different here. Obviously, the cost of living is a lot different here too. So the ratio is different than it is for people in the States. But the reality is that, $15,000 a year, and you're going to get a lot of happy people willing to work for you. 20 grand a year, and you're getting the cream of the crop who are like, I can't make that money at the best company in Mexico. So hell yeah, I'm going to come, work
Mhm.
for you. And so when I look at that and I say I can hire 3 people, 4 people maybe even 5. If you're talking about somebody who costs you $100,000 in the United States, but you can bit 5 of those people in another country, I always look at that and go, is that one person worth the $100,000 a year? Sometimes they might be. They might be worth that if they are someone who's going to work 80 hours a week on your project and they're going to do the work of 4 people because they're that passionate about the project. But if you've just got a clock puncher who's just going to put in the bare minimum because he's just doing a job, that's a line that I don't like to cross. I'm not let's put it this way. I'm 41. I have been running my own business since I was 20. I have no patience for clock punchers at all. I'm just not a fan of, I'm going to work the bare minimum to get my paycheck and that's it. Don't ever ask me to work an extra hour. Don't ever, I'm only going to work the minimum. Um, because I look at guys like Elon Musk and I'm like, do you think Elon Musk has ever thought about working a mere 40 hours a week? Like when you're a business owner and entrepreneur, and you guys know
It
this because
never
it
ends.
never stops. You wake up, you go to
You don't
work.
get weekends.
No,
Sometimes, unless you're very lucky, you get holidays. But the fact of the matter is, when you are a business owner, be it a game studio, construction company, a greeting card company, if you are not working, you're not earning money.
yep. And you don't get to take sick days because the company has legal obligations to its vendors, to its suppliers, to its customers. And if 2 of your guys call in sick, who has to make up for that? Someone does, and if there's no one else on staff to do that, the business owner becomes responsible for that. So there's a lot that goes into being an entrepreneur and covering those extra hours. So when I look at the people I want to work with, I want to work with the people that are willing to go above and beyond, and they're so passionate about the project that they're willing to bleed for it. And this goes way beyond the why am I blanking on this? The crunch culture that you see in a lot of AAA studios, where like CD Projekt Red is the most recent example of like, oh, we got to get this crap fixed before December. Everybody's got to now work, you know, weekends, and you're going to be putting in 80 hours a week, and you've already been doing it for 6 months, but now we're going to ask you to do it for another 3 months. That's bad management at 101, and that's also trying to push a product out just to make a profit as opposed to waiting until the product is ready to do it. There's a lot of mismanagement going on there. But in terms of expenditures, what I'm getting at in my long rambling way is that for the same cost of one person in the United States, you can get 3 to 5 people in other countries who are just as talented, and more than likely, because you're offering them such a big pay scale in terms of so much more money than what they would be offered by any other company in the local environment, they are that much more enthused to show up to work and put in 150% because they're being offered something that they would never get if they worked for a company in their home country. And that's something that I've found to be extremely valuable in building companies and working with people on remote teams over the years is looking outside of the local talent pool where you've got somebody going, well, I'm worth $100,000 a year, and if you're not going to give me that, then piss off. Where I go over here and I've got a guy who's like, you're going to give me 20 grand, dude, crucify me. I'm ready. I'm ready to burn for the cause. Like, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah. Well, with all the I just want to put this in there. With all the negatives
Sure.
that were said about being a business owner, I do want to mention to those that might be interested in owning their own business and running it, there are
So many
just as
cons, so many
many
pros.
benefits to making it. I mean, just the level of satisfaction alone is worth it. Okay, just want to say that because I know how a lot of these things can come across, where it's like you see all these negatives, you're like, oh my god, no way, I ain't doing that no more.
Terrified.
I'm just gonna go, work for Joe down the street. Um, but yeah, I can't help but think back to my youth where I worked at family-run lumber mill, and it's because it's hard manual labor,
Mm-hmm.
um, and my boss would always ask me, like, I'm going on vacation. Will you run the lumber yard this weekend for me? And, I'm like 20, 19, 20 years old. Weekends he's like, yeah. And I'd be like, yeah, I'd be more than happy to. And he was always, I remember one time, the first time, because with my background, I felt this was like a really connected moment for me was, he put his hand on my shoulder, gave me a little squeeze and a shake. And he said he was proud of me because he knew that I would go drinking. And it wasn't the fact that I was choosing to work, it was that I was choosing to help him out, even though I had no obligation whatsoever to do it. And because growing up, I didn't really have much of a father, maybe that instance instilled something in me at a young age to where I'm always willing to go a little further. Like I've had a couple jobs since then before I started working for myself where, they're running on hard times. They had to let someone go that you can barely keep on people that they have now. And I offered to go down to part time. And they always look at you like, why would you ever do that? It's like, if it's going to help you, it's going to help you. Like, well, I need you on this day. It's like, I'll still come in. I'll work, I'll go down to minimum wage, or whatever. We'll make an agreement. And they always seemed really shocked. And maybe it was just because of my age. Because, like that lumberyard job, that was minimum wage. He paid $6 an hour. If you were married, he paid you $6.25 an hour. That's, even back then, it wasn't enough money to live on. But I made it work. And I still look back, and that job was probably one of my favorite jobs I ever had. Even though I could tell you some stories that these days would get that thing shut down.
Oh no, I'm in the same boat because I grew up in a family industry as a third generation ceramic tile and natural stone contractor, and so I worked with my dad, my uncles, and my grandfather from the time I was 7. So think about this for a minute: being on a job site, working 40 hours a week, at 7 years of age, breaks so many labor laws.
Yeah.
And it's like the reality is, family-owned businesses often have a different
They got to do what they got to
yeah,
do.
it's a different operating mentality,
Yeah.
and it doesn't necessarily fly in today's environment of where everything has to be politically correct and perfect, but it still happens,
Right. Let's take for instance like a little mom and pop restaurant, right? Let's say it's owned by a husband and wife team,
The
and
kids are helping.
right. They are, and you can't help but worry because all it's going to take is one person that's got their screw a little loose, and all they see is child labor. When it's like there's no daycare because of COVID or whatnot,
Maybe they
or
can't afford
maybe they just can't
daycare.
afford it. And this is what they have to do. And this is a way to keep them out of trouble because if you just let them go play in the parking lot, someone's going to get hurt. So with the way the world has changed, there's parts of me that, it's about time. But there's also parts of me that I'm just like, I feel really bad for certain people.
I feel old now too, by the way.
Why? Yeah, I also feel it because my hips are sore from sitting so long. But to be fair, working at a lumberyard, I fell off a stack of logs and hurt my back.
Yeah, I've got some war wounds from the construction days, and also just the things that you're witness to when you're working in that environment that you don't see in an office space. People talk differently, people act differently. Blue collar is a different mentality than white collar. There's a lot of stuff that's said that if it was said in a white collar environment would get you sued in a heartbeat. Um, there's it's different these days than it used to be. Um, Pay wise, apart from pay, because I think that's a big thing for me anyway. When I look at the reasons I want to work with a remote team, it all comes back to finances when you're bootstrapping your company. But I also have to think about it, even if, and I can say this because we had, I'm no, whatever, water under the bridge kind of thing. But with Saga Leucemia, we had investors, And so we had the money to pay American people, but just because you can afford to pay engineers in the United States doesn't mean you have to. I find it a more intelligent financial decision to spend that money wisely and make it go as far as possible to help your company. Looking at the good of what's better for the whole team and what's better for the company. Because if you're not spending all that money on rent, and you're not spending all that money on engineers that might not necessarily be worth it, then you've got extra money that could be used on marketing. It could be used on benefits for the team, bonuses at the end of the year. It can be used on, there's a lot to be said for something as simple as sending out Christmas gift baskets to everybody on the team. That might sound cheesy. It might sound cheesy, but people react well to heartwarming gestures. I guess is the maybe a way to say that. Showing people that you give a shit. Not just showing them to give a shit, actually giving a shit enough to make the effort
Yeah.
in the first place. Not so you're not doing it just to make appearances. Um, but I think there's a lot that can be said to treating your people like people as opposed to just a cog in a wheel. Um, and that can be
Right.
tricky. But money, that's the big thing for me. Coming back to the finances of a company and bootstrapping,
Mhm.
insurance. Ugh,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So you guys know that like Epic Games, they have a big, what is that, in North Carolina? They have a big like mall that they rented out,
Hmm.
and everybody
That
goes
was
there.
recent, wasn't it?
So they're gonna have their games there. Their game competition is there.
Chris,
Um,
can you turn on the
some
fan,
some
please?
companies just like to have that brick and mortar store just to show, just to flaunt it off. Um, to say that we have all this money and check out our cool stuff and come work for us. With indies, it's not gonna happen.
It's
It's
not going to
great.
happen.
Mhm.
I wonder, I'm thinking about because when people do that, it's the work-life balance. These companies are trying to provide people with perks that make them feel better to come work for them. Why working for us is better than working for company B?
Yeah, I don't get it because check us out. I'm Joe. I'm a good programmer or I'm a good artist. Hey, I can live on a damn sailboat in the middle of the Atlantic and work, or I mean that's a perk for me. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that?
I think
Just
that's an interesting point. Um, with
pretty soon,
companies, go
pretty
ahead.
soon that's going to be a possibility. We have I guess
Starlink,
Elon
man.
Musk has Starlink up and running, and that could be a possibility here soon. I mean,
I've been on a side note because my brother lives in the middle of nowhere and he does operate on a Wi-Fi tower. Um, and his Wi-Fi tower is a homemade solar powered thing that he built to ping off of the radio tower that's 7 miles away or whatever. And so he had to clear a line of sight from his house to his homemade tower on the top of the hill there because that has a line of sight to the other tower. And he gets good enough speeds, but it's like 15 down on a good day and like 7 up on a good day. Most days it's like, 15, 20 down and 3 or 4 up is what he gets on a good day. And I was showing him Starlink speeds and he's like, "Oh my God, when's this going to be available in my area?" And I was like, "Probably a while because they're starting on the West Coast and slowly moving their way across." But the point you're making is eventually
be,
within the next 5, 10 years, we're going to be at a point where anybody in the world is going to have access to high speed internet.
mhm, it's going to be game changer. And guess what? That comes down to, you got your uh, you have the naturally, you got Bitcoin going crazy, the NFTs. So you have a universal payment system. You have a universal. Pretty soon, you're going to have a universal pay scale because everybody's going to be global. It's not just going to be person making this much money in America or this much money in Mexico. It's going to be global, a global rate. So I mean, I think it's going to get really interesting,
Yeah, and
especially with game.
Yeah, and I think too, I think you're going to see, by the way, that the global rate is not going to be the American rate because it's going to be an average of all the countries around the world. And the reality is that the United States has always been up here in terms of pay brackets. And then when you look at like the entirety of like Central Eastern Europe, all of Asia, Russia, India, all of Latin America, the cost of living is so different, the wages are so much different that when that equality comes in, you're going to see that it's skewed downwards. I already see some companies in the United States complaining about this because they're like, there was one guy I was reading, he was ranting about why no one should agree to work from home. And his reasoning was that by agreeing to work from home for your company, you're showing them that there's no value in you coming into the office. So if there's no value to you coming into the office, what's the difference between you working from home or the guy in Bangladesh working from home who's going to do the same job you do for $4 an hour? And I was like, that's the point of globalization. I don't need to pay you $35 an hour when this guy does the same job for $5 an hour. He's just as talented. There's obviously different perspectives to that, whether depending on what side of that equation you're looking at it from. But yes, I totally agree with you. We're looking at the oncoming globalization of everything, workforce, pay rates, everything else, and non-cash based pay systems with crypto, which
Right.
I'm not fully on board the crypto wagon yet, just because I'm a paranoid individual. Um,
Oh yeah, but
but I have a friend of mine.
it's coming though.
It is coming. I have a friend of mine who started in Bitcoin back in 2014. He started taking Bitcoin for his ebooks,
Yeah.
and he is sitting high and pretty right now because he started doing Bitcoin 7 years ago. And so he has a nice collection now, and he's pretty much retired, and he's 50, and he's like, I'm
I
done.
just say that it makes me want to cry to know that I was doing Bitcoin back in 2000, 2001. I have at least 5 coins sitting in my wallet, and I have no way to get to it because I forget it. I
Yeah,
forget all
I've heard a
the
lot of stories like that, unfortunately. Um, so yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see. And something else, on a side note, not to sidetrack, but I know in my browsing of TikTok, there's a lot of people on TikTok who are talking about their crypto farms, and it's just these little. I've seen a lot like these little 20-year-old girls who are like just getting into college and they're setting up in their room, like they've got 4 or 5 graphics cards. They're talking about how yeah, it only makes like $1,500 a month, but when you start thinking about a college kid who's making $1,500 a month off of something that's, and I hesitate to use this terminology, so I'm going to use air quotes, passive income, because it does obviously take some initial setup costs and everything else. But once it gets going and it's paying for itself, it's fairly self sustaining. And I think they're farming Ethereum, I think is what it's called.
Ethereum.
Ethereum. Thank you for correcting me on that. Like I said, I'm not
I'm a
huge into it.
crypto supporter, so
Gotcha. Yeah, I would like to learn more about it, so I may have to have some conversations with you because I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by it, and I have the one friend who I know has done very well in it, which makes me realize that it's not a myth, but at the same time, it's
no,
like,
change is scary.
I have like
yes,
100 Dogecoin.
hey,
You want a stick of gum?
All
Eight 8 cents.
right. Are there any other pros, cons, things we want to discuss in the scope of remote working from home, working with remote teams globally, etc.?
No, I'm good. I
I
think we
don't think
hit.
so,
Yeah.
because it all comes down to your individual needs. If for whatever reason you need to have a brick and mortar presence, then by all means, that's what you should pursue. It's just something where, because of the pandemic, one of the positives that have come out of this is that a lot of technology has shifted to allow remote working to be much more simplified and much more widely acceptable. So if you can get by with that, maybe that's your best option. It may not even be a bad idea to start with remote, and then as things progress, maybe transition to a brick
I'm
and mortar.
glad you said that because that was going to be my next question was, do you guys have you even talked about that yet? Because I know I had discussed it when I was still involved with Stormhaven Studios, my plan for the company was to take the first bit of profit we had and do what the Mist guys did and purchase a commercial property, convert a portion of it into studio space. But the reality is, there were only, I think, 2 or 3 of the team members out of all the people who worked for the team who would even want to consider moving to that physical location, which then made it more of a question of, does the company even need to have a studio space if only 2 or 3 people are going to move there? So that, have you guys even talked about that, or is it even on the agenda?
It has to be one of those things where you have to do the cost benefit analysis of the brick and mortar. Um, right now, I wouldn't see it being feasible.
Well, also, I mean,
If
you guys, like, you've got a kid and families. I mean, let's say the studio decided to put itself in Boulder, Colorado. Are you going to uproot your family and move to Boulder, Colorado just because your studio is doing well?
I mean,
I
it's
mean,
one of
that's a great. I think it's a big question, but
it would be if there's a reason for me to be present the entire time.
sure.
I mean,
It's not. I don't think it's an easy question to answer. That's the thing. It's so many factors go into that, which I think is a great closing point. Like Lexer was saying, it depends on your unique situation. Is remote right for you? I think there's a lot of reasons to go remote. Um, from my perspective, there's more reasons to be remote than there are to be physical, but that's just my perspective. I don't know. Hopefully, we'll get comments from people who will let us know what they feel. I don't know how many people have transitioned to remote because of COVID, not just within game development, but um, how many people out there have gone remote with their day job? Or
I'm
how,
sure it would be surprising.
it's probably a hybrid. I bet it's a pretty high number because there's not that many. The only one I can think of where you can't is like hotels. You can't you can't manage a
Anything that
hotel
requires
remotely.
a lot of physical, I want to say labor, but I just mean like having to be able to physically do things.
The dentist example I
Then
used earlier, I like because Chris actually has to go to the dentist, and that's one of the few businesses I can think of that has still kind of carried on is the medical industry for the most part. But restaurants, that's kind of, I mean, you can't have people in your restaurant. You don't need all the wait staff. Maybe you need your cooks. You keep your cooks on staff, and you can do takeaway, but you don't need 10 waiters on staff. Um, So yeah, I'd be interested to hear how many people have gone remote and whether they liked it or not. So feel free to drop comments below. And I think that's a good enough place to wrap this up, everybody. So first and foremost, don't forget to check out all the links below to go over to these guys' page to defend the night. Check that out. There's a link to their Discord website. Check their game out. All the links to the stuff I'm working on. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell icon so that you get updates for all the future content that we do. And stay tuned for next week's episode, which will be coming at you next Monday. Until then, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody.
thank you guys.